Yo guys, what's up? It's CG Inferno and today I am bringing you another review. So today's review will be for Fate Samurai, which is the latest entry for the Fate series. I'll be essentially giving my thoughts on the game after playing about 50 hours or so pretty much. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So for the story, I won't be diving too deep into it, mainly just because of spoiling stuff and people still obviously want to play it and everything. So I'll be giving like a quick rundown of the story and some of the characters that you meet throughout the story as well. So essentially the story in this Fate game puts us into the protagonist named called Iori, who is living a simple life with his sister. However, on one night a group of people came to attack him as they see he has the mark of a master on his hand. He puts up a good fight, however he is then tasked with facing a servant whose name is Ryder and is overwhelmed by them quickly. Almost dying, he then summons his own servant and manages to survive. Throughout the story, you will meet different masters and servants along with rogue servants as well. Some of these you might have recognized from previous game and the anime as well. While some of these want to complete the ritual, others are not really too fussed about it as well and want nothing to do with it. During the game, you will team up with a variety of servants and rogue servants who will help you in your battles against other masters and their servants, along with other rogue servants as well that you might come across. There's one particular rogue servant, however, that does not fire at all, but I think most people can guess who it is already just by his presence alone, and you'll meet him quite early on in the game as well. Now, as for side content in the game, there is quite a bit to do. There is a thing called digressions, which is basically a servant side story. It fleshes out their characters quite a bit and gives you more insight into the story that is happening and as well. Bear in mind, some of these are not unlocked until you do a second run of the game, which is when they will appear. I'll expand on that a bit later. The other side content in the game ranges from doing commissions for certain NPCs. These essentially work like mini missions where you can see what needs to be done. This can range from talking to like a variety of NPCs, killing a certain amount of enemies with a certain style, or killing say one particular enemy probably like 200 times or so. This is where a lot of the time will add up if you're trying to go for 100%. And one last side content is the battle recollection. So essentially how this works is that during the game you'll come across certain boss fights which are like, you know, the main big boss fights throughout the game, and you can fight them again and you get some rewards as well. There's quite a few of them to do, especially if you're trying to 100%. You essentially need to go through the game at least 3 times to get all of them to appear, which is, I guess, a nice incentive to do, and it keeps you somewhat busy. But at the same time, I can kind of see people getting tired of it and stuff and going through the same stuff over and over again. But I'll explain more on the new game plus like in a little segment itself. Now, for the length of the story or how it's split up, it's basically done as one prologue, 5 chapters, and then 3 final chapters, with 2 of them being done on New Game Plus. So on your first run, or my first run I should say, it took about 42 hours or so, and that was me doing about a fair amount of the side content that's in the game, so like all the digressions that appear on that run, and also the NPCs that you talk to that give you these little mini missions that I just spoke about earlier. And after doing 3 runs to get all the endings, my final time was around the 52 to like 56 hour mark. So yeah, they were not lying saying that the game is around 50 hours or so to complete, depending on playstyle and difficulty and all that. Obviously, if you just gun for the story straight, it will cut it down significantly, but I feel if you're just gonna do that, you're missing quite a bit of lore in a sense, which I don't think you really want to skip out in these games. So I would suggest doing some of the side digressions, as some of them are pretty decent overall. I'll explain that more on that later. As for the voice acting in the game, it's superb. Honestly, I enjoyed every bit of it. They've done a great job in portraying the characters that they were voice acting. Honestly, I just had no issues with it. Most of the game, I think if not all of the game, was more or less voiced for the most part, so you're not going to be having to be reading text all the time. But one down, I wouldn't even say a downside for me, but for some people it might be a downside, and that is that there's no English dub, unfortunately. And with these games, I don't think they're really gonna try and push for English dub unless there's like a super big market for it. But yeah, that's probably like the only downside to it. Now, overall for the story in itself, I enjoyed it quite a bit. It was super solid. There were some points where I felt the story did quite drag for quite some time. I think they could have shortened down some of the chapters, especially chapter 2. That one was like super long. But apart from that, yeah, I think if you are in the whole Fate series and all that, I think you'll enjoy this one easily. All the gameplay in Fate Samurai, this is done in the Musou style, so if you've played previous entries of the Fate series or other Musou games like Dynasty Warriors and stuff, you'll easily get into this. And you know, with these games, there's not like a super big depth into like how the combat works. You just have your usual combos, special move as well, along with some other like slightly varianted combos as well. So there's not too much to go into that, but that is Musou games for you. You're literally just there bashing hundreds of enemies. However, in this game, you're not really facing like hordes of enemy. I noticed that when you go into these fights, most times you're fighting probably about 10 to like 15 enemies on average. Sometimes you're even fighting less, and these fights will be done within like a minute or two pretty much at most. There are some enemies though that have a shell gauge, so these enemies are mainly boss fights that you see throughout the game and certain enemies as well. How this works essentially is that is their like defense mechanic, more or less. So essentially this is where you will use your servant's abilities. Servant's abilities will pretty much shred through this along with their normal attacks as well, and once the gauge is depleted, basically the enemy will be stunned for a bit, allowing you to deal more damage to them. And when they're in a stun state, you tend to do a lot more damage than you do when they're like moving about and stuff. There are some instances though where you will not have your servant to deal with these type of enemies, and when you're playing with the MC, if you can perfect dodge, you can stun the enemy with an attack, and then you can start depleting their shell gauge as well, which helps quite a bit. Do note that if the enemy is not stunned, then your normal attacks with the MC will just bounce straight off pretty much. However, there is an ability in the game that you can get which mitigates this. However, you will be getting this ability like either end of the game or your new game plus run, which is when I got it. And honestly, I would say it helps quite a bit. It doesn't deplete their shell gauge as fast as say a servant, but every bit helps pretty much when fighting an enemy that has one of those on. Boss fights in the game are pretty good for the most part. They're nothing too special though, and sometimes they can drag quite a bit, but for the most part I did enjoy them, especially the final chapters one. I think they've done a really good job on that. There are quite a lot of boss fights in the game, and some of them are done during like the servant side quests, so if you're not really doing the digressions, as I said earlier, you're going to miss out on some of them, as there's like one really good boss fight which I think a lot of people probably do, especially because I kind of hinted at it earlier that this side character, I wouldn't even call him a side character, but this rogue servant, you do eventually get to face him at some point, which is quite not hard, but it is a long battle on your first playthrough. But honestly, I think for the most part most boss fights are fine. However, they do essentially just do the same moves over and over again, which just bores out the fight. And once you get a read on what moves they're going to do, essentially you can just almost no damage them pretty much. You can just perfect dodge them all the time with like the main character, or even like the servants as well, as they can do it as well. And yeah, you'll probably just shred through them at that point. So I kind of wish they kind of mixed up some of these boss fights a bit more, but I guess when you got a Musou game, they're just going to be more or less your standard ones with certain moves here and there. Now, in terms of playing the main character Iori, he has 5 styles which he can switch between with, and has access to spells as well, which range from fire style moves, regenerating HP, and secret moves that are obtained from certain servants when you complete their side stories. All of these spells use gems which you can either craft, buy from a certain shop, or drop from certain enemies you fight throughout the game. As for the styles, essentially 4 of them are obtained throughout the story, and 1 of them is obtained through the workshop. Each of these styles have different movesets to an extent, which you can use to your advantage in some fights as well. The game does well in terms of explaining how each stance works, so most players won't feel discouraged or overwhelmed about it. Now personally, by like the end of the game, the only styles I was really using was the fire style and void style, which were super good. Wind style's not too bad, but it kind of works in a way where you need your magic bar. If you don't have it, you're basically not really utilizing that stance well. Water stance is more for dodging and just somewhat crowd control in a sense, even though these enemies die within like a hit or two pretty much. And earth style is basically your defense style, where when you upgrade it essentially with the skill tree and stuff, you actually get some nice moves to it where you can counter enemies, or if you die you can get resurrected one time. So as you can see, there is like quite a bit to play with. However, getting all of these abilities, it does take some time. So again, as I said earlier, if you're not really doing all the side stuff, then half of these abilities you're not even going to touch at that point of the game. Now this comes into my next point, which is the skills tree. So the skill tree in the game works both for the MC and the playable servants in the game. These give you access to more moves and more spells for each stance for the MC, as well as increasing your overall stats as well. For the servants, most of these skills are just stat boosts, so for like strength, your defense, all of that stuff, HP, your affinity gauge and all of that, that's the main stuff that you get with them. However, with Saber, you will be getting a bit more than that, mainly because Saber's your servant, like your main servant, and they essentially have access to more moves than usual, so you can get more abilities to use from than the standard ones that you just have throughout the game, essentially upgrading their stats as well, so they can do more damage to say humans or monsters or whatnot. So you can see there's quite a bit to go through. Again, obviously if you want to try and go for everything, you're not going to get in your first playthrough. It's most likely going to be your second or third playthrough pretty much, which is where, you know, the 100-hour mark came from them when they say if you want 100% it, because it does take quite some time to do. But for the skill tree in itself, I think they've done a pretty decent job for the most part. I think maybe with some of the other rogue servants that you get, maybe they could have added in more moves that they could have used and stuff, because essentially these other rogue servants, they just have 3 somewhat special moves and then a 4th one that raises their special gauge, which allows them to use their noble phantasm. Speaking of which, to unlock their noble phantasm, you need to learn their true name, which sometimes you won't, for some of the servants you won't get in your first playthrough. You actually have to go through the game again, and then new digressions appear. So yeah, just keep that in mind. But I kind of wish they had more moves to use in a sense, because using the same 3 moves does get a bit boring in a sense. One final note on the gameplay is the ley lines. So essentially there's a part of the story where you'll be forced to go and use a ley line, which kind of works like Fire Emblem in a sense. So you'll basically be taking up a spot, say for example they'll spawn you in one spot, and then you basically have to reach to say another town in a sense in the game, and there'll be enemies and stuff as well. So how it works is basically you need to basically assert dominance more or less, and not let the enemies try and cut off your ley line, because if they do that, you basically go back to the start. Now there are ways to mitigate this. So one way is for Saber to intercept them, or for you to actually go and teleport using the mystic codes that you can get in the game. To be fair, this whole ley line thing, I didn't mind it too much, but it did drag out some of the chapters quite a bit, because sometimes it does take quite a bit of time to go through. And you also have a certain amount of turns. So if you go over a certain amount of turns without capturing certain points, you basically will game over and have to retry from a certain point of that section, which happened to me a few times. But you know, once you get the hang of it, it's not too bad. But I think with that ley line whole section, I think they could have slightly improved on it. I think most people will probably not be too fond of it. Some might like it, some might not, but yeah, I think it could have been done a bit better. It's not the worst, but it's definitely not the best. Now, while I have praised the game for like maybe the majority of the video, I'd say there is one improvement or feature, I should say, that I wish was in the game and could have honestly made this game like a 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10 game more or less. And that is having a free mode where you can actually test out the servers, because playing a servant in the game, you're pretty much restricted heavily. So essentially in a normal battle, they have a gauge that you need to fill up, which takes quite a long time as well. Once filled and you switch to them, you've got about 15 to 20 seconds tops using them. and their moves and stuff before you switch back to the main character, and again you have to raise that bar up again, and that just takes forever. Now there are certain instances where you can use them without this whole gauge. Basically the game forces you to use them, and while it's fun and all that, but you'll only get to use them for like that battle, and then that's pretty much it. And I noticed throughout the game, it's like I kind of wanted to use these servants a lot more, and I think other people that are planning to play this game would like to think that they can use them a lot more as well, but you're like super restricted to just using the main character. Like even with Saber, who's basically there with you 24/7, you can't use consistently. Like I know the servants are like stupidly powerful and stuff, and if you could use them all the time, you basically just blitz through the game pretty much. But if there was a free mode, you know, to just say go from point A to point B, beating up these enemies and facing this boss using, you know, these servants, I think that would have been good. Mainly because I wouldn't say I didn't get enough time. It's just that using these servants, you're very, very, very limited. So you basically just have to work quick with them. And yeah, I think that was a slight oversight on their part. I'm not too sure why it was not there, or why we can't use the servants for even longer, because you know that's what mainly this whole, I wouldn't even say like the game, mainly like the series, like when it comes to these games and stuff, people want to use the servants. That's not to say that the MC is bad or anything, but you're gonna get tired of playing the MC like probably by chapter 2 or 3 pretty much. So yeah, I kind of wish Koei added that into the game. Maybe they could add it in later through a patch or whatnot, but you just have to wait and see. But that's my only complaint with the game pretty much, is that using the servants, you're super limited to time with it pretty much. Now with all that said and done, we've pretty much come to the end of the video, so I'm just going to give my final thoughts on the game. Fate Samurai is a solid game all around. For Musou game as well, which tend to be like hit or miss half the time, if they're not done correctly pretty much. I think Koei for the most part done this right. They definitely got a lot of the stuff done right. The story was great, voice acting was great, music was good, combat was fun for the most part, excluding, you know, how long you can use the servants for pretty much. Yeah, I just kind of wish that the boss fights were somewhat more interesting. Being able to use servants for way longer than you should be able to, maybe probably like a free mode, as I said, or something like that. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Honestly, if you're a Fate fan, this is easy recommendation for you guys. You're not gonna hate this game at all. Like, you might have a few issues here and there, but for the most part I think you'll enjoy it. And if you're the person that's saying not really a Fate fan series, but enjoy action game, Musou games and all of that stuff with like somewhat of an RPG element to it as well, then yeah, I can easily say you should buy this game as well. So yeah, I hope this review was helpful. If you've got any more questions about the game, about any specific stuff, you know, leave a comment and stuff, or hit me up on Twitter, or X as it's called now. But yeah, I can say that I thoroughly enjoyed myself with the game, and honestly I think a lot of people will at this point. So good job to Koei for actually bringing out a good game for Fate, honestly, because this could have easily gone wrong if they just completely went off the rails, but thankfully they didn't. So yeah, again, if you got any questions, let me know. Hopefully you enjoyed this review, and I will see you guys next time.